So now to this evening's presentation. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Erik Aslaksen, to address us on the subject of society as an information processing system and the influence of the media. A fascinating topic, Erik, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it. Erik was elected Fellow of the Society in 2014 and has been active on Council and many of its committees ever since. Currently, he is Secretary of the Fellows and Members Assessment Committee. You can read a longer version of his biography in the agenda for this meeting. The short version is that Erik is an engineer and physicist with over 50 years of industrial experience in microwave components, power electronics, quantum electronics, and telecommunications. His work in these areas in the US, Switzerland, and Australia range from basic research to corporate management. Erik is the author of 8 books and many book chapters and peer-reviewed publications. A warm welcome to you, Erik. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Susan, and good evening, everybody. I acknowledge the Gayamigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which I live and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It is both a privilege and a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you about the subject that has been the focus of my research for the last 5 years or so, and that is the evolution of society. This endeavor grew out of my long-standing interest and involvement in engineering methodology and education, and the role of engineers in society. And at the Forum on Philosophy, Engineering and Philosophy in Beijing in 2012, I met Donald Hector, who introduced me to the Royal Society of New South Wales, and well, here I am. The evolution of society is not an esoteric or far-fetched subject. On the contrary, what could be closer to us than society? It is what we experience every day through our interactions with other people, within a particular structure and set of rules and customs. Our meeting here this evening is an example of such a social event. And society certainly has evolved, from groups of cave dwellers to our present nation states, and increasingly, albeit slowly and with many hiccups, towards a world society of some form. The by far most common and developed description of a society is in terms of its physical characteristics, such as population, GDP, income and wealth distributions, level of technology and education, CO2 emissions, and so on. The evolution of society is therefore also described mainly as the changes to the values of these characteristics. And our concerns regarding society are also related to such physical characteristics. Think global warming, poverty, hunger, pandemics, and so on. This evening, I would like to present to you a different view of society, and with it, a shift in focus of our concerns regarding society's evolution. My approach to this is to first introduce 4 separate ideas about society and its evolution, and then bring these together to form a high level, in the sense of high level of abstraction, view of society. Applying that view to society as it is today brings out 2 concerns, both of which can be seen as symptoms of an underlying disease of the process that drives the evolution of society. And I will end with a comment on the relevance of this to education. The first idea is to see the evolution of society as the current stage in the general process of evolution, starting in principle with the Big Bang. And this idea is developed in 2 parts. a general part and a specific part. A possible identification of the stages of the general process is shown in this table. And leaving out the first stage, which is still under some discussion, the evolution progressed through a number of stages, each one conceptually consisting of two phases. A growth phase, in which the density of elements increased, and with it the intensity of their interaction, until in the interaction phase, new entities were formed. And if we generalize the concept of energy to include human activities, we can view this formation of new entities as converting some of the free energy of the elements into bound energy in the new entities. In each stage, the complexity of the new entities increased. And if we think of the proportion of free energy to total energy as temperature, the temperature decreased from stage to stage. But also, if we think of two elements interacting to form a new compound element, the energy must be great enough to overcome the repulsive potential and form a permanent bond, but not so great that the bond is disrupted. That is, the temperature in which an entity can exist is a narrow range, and it decreases with increasing complexity. We are familiar with this in the form of homeostasis and the very narrow range of internal temperature required for the existence of the cells in our own bodies. In the second specific part of the development of this idea, the last stage of this process is expanded to show more detail in the evolution of the entity we are interested in, the human society. It has evolved through a similar sequence of stages. For example, families, clans, fiefdoms, kingdoms, and nation states. Stages of increasing complexity and bound energy, and correspondingly, a decrease of what we might think of as society's temperature. The bound energy is represented in the form of a common infrastructure. And to make this generalized concept of energy more specific, we can let the total energy or effort be represented by the GDP, and the bound part of this energy, the common infrastructure, be represented by the total government expenditure. As the society evolves, the proportion of bound energy increases, as shown here for Sweden, the red line, and Australia, blue line, so that for a mature nation state, the ratio of bound to total energy is in the range of 18 to 26%. Allow me to make a quick digression here by introducing an analogy between humans and water molecules. At high temperatures, the water molecules move around freely, colliding infrequently, but not forming any lasting relationships. This is the very early phase of hominin existence as individuals. As the temperature drops, at some point the molecules condense into a body of water, where their freedom of movement is restricted and the interaction with other molecules is much greater. This is the phase of nomadic societies. If the temperature drops further, the water freezes and becomes a block of ice, restricting the freedom of the molecules to move even further, but enabling them to engage in collaborative movements with their fellow molecules in the form of vibrations. This is the phase of settled societies that started with the agrarian revolution. And the block of ice now has the new property of rigidity, of being able to resist external attempts to change its shape. As long as the temperature stays below 0 degrees, the block of ice remains unchanged if we ignore sublimation. But once the temperature reaches 0 degrees, Any increase in the free energy results in the melting of a part of the ice. If the energy is subsequently lowered, the water will freeze again, but now the ice has a somewhat different shape. And of course, if the energy is increased too much, the whole ice block turns into water and the original shape is lost. Thus, for a smooth evolution of society, the fluctuations in free energy have to be just right. Too small and society ossifies, too large and the result is catastrophic. This is sometimes expressed by saying that society evolves on the edge of chaos, but there is nothing chaotic about the phase transition of water. And I expect the same to be true of the dynamics of society. Now, let us continue on to the second idea. We tend to focus on society's members, on their ethnicity, religion, level of education, level and distribution of their income and wealth, and so on. But without the interaction between them, there would be no society, just a collection of individuals. And in this sense, everything you can observe when you look around in a society is dependent on this interaction. An individual would not be able to produce any of it, and neither would a million non-interacting individuals, as a million times zero is still zero. So, idea number 2 tells us to focus on the interaction and to represent society as a system of interacting individuals. This is a high level of abstraction, but it highlights the essential function of the interactions. Turn the interactions off, and the system becomes a collection of individuals. The interactions create the system properties, that is, properties that cannot be ascribed to individuals, also called emergent properties, because they emerge as the interactions are turned on. Idea number 3 is based on the observation that actions are determined by the information available to the actor at the time of action. Information consisting of both the information stored in the actor's memory and the information received through the senses at the time of action. Everything created by humans, by human action, could be described in terms of the information that led to these actions. And so we end up with 2 complementary descriptions of society, either in physical terms, things and actions, or in terms of information. Reflecting this onto the previous idea of society as a system, we can view society as an information processing system, with individuals as the processors and the interaction between them in the form of information exchanges. And within this description of society as an information processing system, we can divide the information roughly into 2 groups. One is the factual and largely uncontroversial information of everyday life, mostly connected with family, life, work, education, sport, and entertainment. Information that does not create significant conflicts or inconsistencies with our stored information. The other, and very much smaller group, is the information that relates to our beliefs, attitudes, behavior, and social norms, sometimes called the things that matter. This information may conflict with our stored information, and the resolution of this conflict may result in a change to our beliefs. It is this group of information that is involved in changes to society. And in the rest of this talk, I'm focusing exclusively on that group. The processing of this information by all the individuals is what I call the collective intelligence. It is a consensus building process. So, the picture of this information processing system I would like you to keep in mind is this one. The individuals can obtain information by a discovery process, for example, by observing nature, and by an intentional interaction with the common repository of society's stored information, as in libraries and data banks of various forms. But then there is the daily exchange of information with other individuals, what we might call the circulating information, in the form of face-to-face interaction, newspapers, radio, TV, internet, and social media. And this is, for most people, the main source of information. Now, society is an immensely complex entity, no matter if we describe it in physical terms or in terms of information. However, with our view of society as a system, we can employ a well-known approach within the system methodology, the top-down approach, developing the description and understanding of the complex entity in a sequence of levels of increasing detail or decreasing levels of abstraction. And doing this is the fourth idea. At the top level, we describe the system as consisting of a set of identical individuals. That is, with identical information processing and storage capabilities, and a set of identical interactions between them, that is, with identical access to information. As indicated in the diagram, this description can be developed in further detail, level by level, into an increasingly powerful and complex description of society and its evolution. But that is not a matter for this evening's presentation. Instead, let us see what we can say about society already at this top level. Even though it is indeed a very high level of abstraction, ignoring the numerous differences between individuals and between their access to and ability to process information, it can still provide some useful insights. It is somewhat similar to using per capita quantities in economics. The first thing we can say is that with society characterized by its information content, the evolution of society is the evolution of this information content. That content is created in individuals by discovery, as indicated in the earlier picture of the information flow in society, but also by mental processing of information items in the form of recognizing relationships between them. Just as a system of physical elements can have emergent properties, relationships between information items can result in new information. The saying, "there's nothing new under the sun," is clearly not true in the information domain. Thus, discounting any divine intervention, the evolution of society is determined by the information processing capabilities of our brains. Our society is what it is today because we made it so, and we determine what it will be tomorrow. It is then reasonable to ask what determines the direction of this evolution. Or perhaps an even more basic question would be, is there any direction at all? Or is evolution simply a form of random walk? Let me give you my personal answer. There is no goal to evolution. It is not progressing towards something. It is impossible to know where it will lead, just as 100 million years ago, it would have been impossible to predict the appearance of man. But evolution is not a random walk. And ever since life began, the overriding decision criterion has been the same: survival. Survival is the basic measure of success in the process of life, the cycle of birth and death. It is just that as the complexity of the entities increased, so did the complexity of both the meaning of survival, that is, what survives, and the criteria for achieving it. To keep a complex entity like our bodies alive, we sacrifice thousands of cells every day. And as society evolved, survival changed from that of the individual to include that of the social entity. As the information processing and the associated decision-making takes place in the individual, there is the issue or problem of the relationship between the individual and society. How is the information processing of the individual reflected in the behavior of society? This is the issue of the political system, and in the view of society presented here, it is reflected in the organization of the information flow and of the access to information. That is, in the structure of the information processing system. It is my belief, and it must remain a belief, that the best structure is the uniform structure, or if you like, no structure, with complete equality of the individuals in the information processing system. This is the unrestricted operation of the collective intelligence, and it is a representation of the ideal democracy. And when I say best, it only means that the path of evolution will be the one with the greatest chance of survival. It does not relate to any feature of society. Any tampering with this free flow of information, that is, with the operation of the collective intelligence, will lead to a fluctuation in the direction of decreased likelihood of survival, as demonstrated, for example, by 2 world wars. So, our view is that it is impossible to know how society will evolve, and there is no measure of this evolution. But we can measure the process that drives the evolution of society, the collective intelligence, both in its quality, information freedom, and intensity, information flow. The other component of the collective intelligence, the processing capability and capacity of the human brain, has not changed significantly over the last 10,000 years or so. The second thing we can say, even at this high level of abstraction, is that the evolution of the information exchange has been dominated by the evolution of the medium of exchange. Starting at 0 with face-to-face exchange, the symbolic representation of information from picture to alphabet, and which could overcome both the time and distance limitations of face-to-face exchange, led to an ever-increasing demand for enabling technology, from clay tablets through papyrus, paper, ink, printing presses, to today's information technology. That technology represents a very significant investment, and this investment has owners. In some nations, for example China, the owner of much of the media is the state. In the West, which is the focus of my concern, it is individuals, generally via shareholdings. With ownership comes control, and when that ownership is concentrated in a relatively small group of people, it is understandable that the flow of information will, to a greater or lesser extent, reflect the views of that group. The concentration of ownership in the media, in a relatively small number of individuals and families is a peculiarity of this industry. And the reason for this has been given as the high amenity of ownership in the form of prestige and social visibility and influence, as compared with other industries where the benefit is more focused on financial performance. The question is then, what combined wealth value is likely to include the majority of the adults who own and control the greater part of the industry that produces the majority of the circulating information? Considering that the capitalization of the major media corporations is somewhere around $2 trillion in 2019, and given the previous comment about the prestige and influence on opinion provided by ownership, we might set this level of combined wealth at $5 trillion US, which is about 1.4% of the global wealth, according to the Credit Suisse 2019 report. That is the combined wealth of a small number of the world's wealthiest people, as shown in this table, of which the majority is in the West. And this gives an indication of the concentration of media ownership and control. This concentration and its resultant effect on the quality of the public discourse is the first of my two concerns. It is important to emphasize that the dominance of this group of the information flow is not realized by limiting the freedom of publication. On the contrary, it has never been easier to make one's opinions public. The internet and social media platforms, such as Facebook and Twitter, are available at very moderate cost or even for free. The dominance arises out of volume, and with it, the ability to catch people's attention. There is no need to worry, or at least not too much, about opposition to the established conservative order. Nobody can hear anything but the loudest voices. And as a result, what we get through the media is a very one-sided view of reality. This is something we can easily observe here in Australia. Current examples are the depictions of China and that of the West. In the physical realm, we are concerned about our diet. Is it balanced? Do we get enough vitamins? Is it not past its use-by date? Does it contain poisonous substances? And so on. But do we show the same concern for the information we are exposed to? Also in the physical realm, we expect the common infrastructure to provide such services as reliable energy, clean water, and a high standard of sanitations. Why do we not expect that infrastructure to also provide us with quality information? The second concern arises out of my assertion that the current stage in the evolution of society is special, and there are several arguments in support of this assertion. The current stage in the sequence of stages we introduced earlier is that the elements are nations. The world's population is contained in something less than 200 more or less well-defined and stable nations. One possible final step in the evolution could then be that these nations form the last new entity, a world society in the form of a United Nations. But in the sequence of stages, the motivation for the grouping of elements into a new, more complex entity was the net benefit it brought to the elements in competition with other similar entities. And for this last step in forming a world society and discounting a Star Wars scenario, there will be no other entity to compete with, so that this motivation is missing. This is reflected in the lack of success in progressing in this direction. First the League of Nations and now the United Nations. The annual budget of the United Nations is only 0.06% of world GDP. So compared with the about 20% for the common infrastructure of a developed society like a nation, as we saw earlier, we are still only fumbling. Another feature that makes today's society special has its origin in about 1450 AD. Up until that time, the world's population had developed as largely disconnected societies in various parts of the world: Europe, the Americas, China, India, and so on. But at that time, for reasons that are well known, one part of the world, what we now identify as the West, was able to embark on a quest to conquer, colonize, and subdue the rest of the world, mainly by the use of force and often brutally, and to extract a great deal of wealth that spurred the accelerated development of science and technology in the West. That chapter is now at an end, but the result is that a relatively small part of the world, say 1 billion people out of a world population of 7 billion, is enjoying a standard of living several times that of the rest of the world. So the second argument in support of my assertion is that we have a polarization on a world scale never seen before. I might also note that this polarization is the main reason why the second option for the next step in the evolution of society, that the nations form a number of groups of nations, with these groups developing into entities, each with its own common infrastructure and competing on a level playing field, is unlikely. The West seems bent on maintaining its hegemonic position, and the main component of this is to portray any emerging group as an enemy rather than as a competitor and partner in the world society. The third argument for why we are at a special stage of evolution is that it is only in the last 50 years or so that we have realized the fact that what we call nature, or our physical environment, is no longer something that exists independently of us. And it is getting to the point that this nature is increasingly manufactured by us. It is becoming a product of and integrated into our society, just like the built environment. This new integrated society of tomorrow and into the future will be our product, a product of the collective intelligence. So my second concern is that we are not acknowledging that we have arrived at this special stage in our evolution, and that both its seriousness and its integrated nature are being suppressed in the public discourse. Don't rock the boat, life is good, and the money is rolling in. With this view of the evolution of society as a production process, I would like to draw an analogy with industrial production processes and the quality revolution that took place during the 50s and 60s. Basically, it was the realization that the most cost-effective approach to ensuring a high-quality product, as evidenced, for example, by a low failure rate, was not to perform extensive testing of the product with associated corrective work or rejection of defective products, but by identifying what part of the process was the cause of the defects and then fixing that. The analogy is that society at every level, state, national, international, has many defects. And instead of just focusing on fixing those defects, we should also focus on the process that produced that society and determine how it can be improved so that it will, in the future, produce societies with less defects. So, my two concerns are really only different aspects of the same concern: the operation of the collective intelligence, and that brings me to the last issue I would like to raise. If we, just for a moment, think of society as an organism, then there are a number of activities in society that convert effort and energy into creating the conditions for society to exist, ranging from garbage collection to the operation of the judicial system. And we can think of these activities as constituting the metabolic process of society. If we then turn from such activities to our view of society as an information processing system, the metabolism in that view is education, the transmission of information from one generation to the next. It is what is required just to keep the process going. And just as we earlier divided information into two groups, education can be divided into two components according to their purpose. This was done already by Emil Durkheim, who wrote, "The object of education is to arouse and to develop in the child a certain number of physical, intellectual, and moral states which are demanded of him by both the political society as a whole and the special milieu for which he is specifically destined." Now, Durkheim wrote this around 1900, that is, towards the end of La Belle Époque, so he accordingly saw society as something fairly stable, something to which the individual's relationship was largely one of fitting into. Today's society is changing more rapidly, so to be an effective contributor to this evolution requires not only an understanding of society as it is today, but also of its dynamics, of the forces that drive its evolution, and of the relationship between society and the individual. But are we equipping our children to become effective contributors to the public discourse? From what I can see in the news, the educational focus is on literacy and numeracy and on STEM subjects. And I see some of this reflected here in the Royal Society also. Of the subjects available to year 11 and 12 students in New South Wales, only 2 address society and its evolution: modern history and society and culture. From the description of their content and objectives, they appear excellent. But the problem is that only 15% of students take modern history and only about 2% take society and culture. So I might conclude with the thought that perhaps our view of education and its purpose has become too skewed towards the immediate task of earning a living. And that at a time when many of those tasks are the ones most likely to be taken over by computers and or robots. And I leave you with this quote from Karl Popper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik. That was a tour de force of an extraordinary range, and you particularly, I think, vivid metaphors. I love the metaphor of the ice block and the way it moved forwards and backwards. I suppose my first question is this. You begin with that thermodynamic engineering view of the universe, and you move right through to education and information. And I wonder whether that notion of information shifts between the beginning of your talk in the thermodynamic and the latter part, where it isn't really the Shannon and Weaver engineering view of information, but a much richer view of information that you're drawing on.
Well, that's true. I mean, what I presented here is a very high level, the highest level of this model. And my intention with starting out with the example of a general process of evolution is just to show the importance of the increase in the interaction, and with it, the more complex structures, and the idea of the lowering of the temperature. Well, I mean, the idea of society's temperature is interesting. It's not particularly useful. Maybe you can think of sort of the French Revolution as being a high temperature moment, but otherwise, no, you're right. The concept of information, of course, can be taken to much greater level of detail. I just haven't done that here in this talk.
Perhaps I can just put that same question slightly differently, Erik, if I may. We begin with a description of society as a natural process doing its thing, and then we move to some really deep and strong prescriptive and normative claims about what should be happening in the society. And I suppose I'd like to see how you'd like to tie them together a bit.
Well, I think the transition from the physical part was really only to make that transition between the general process and looking at the evolution of society as a stage in that process. So that when we look at the various structures or the elements of the increasing complexity in society, from family to clan and to the nation state, that is really the same increase in interaction strength and the increase in what I call the bound energy, which is if you look at activities as energy, then it's the activities that people are involved in as a society rather as their activities as individuals by themselves.
There's a question here from Ian Bryce. It says, do emergent properties allow breaking the laws which govern the more basic individuals?
The laws that govern the individuals. I'm not quite sure. The law, I mean, individuals in society are governed by the laws of society. If you think of the physical laws that govern individuals, I mean, that's a matter of medical knowledge and you know, what for instance, the homeostasis, that we can't take large temperature fluctuations and so on. I'm not exactly sure what the laws governing the individuals, what that actually means there.
I'm not sure that I understood that question, but I took it to be in slightly the same area as I was, that this shift from the physicalistic description to this much broader, which is very interesting. I've got a question here from Donald Hector, which talks about that shift to the normative understanding of our society and what's right about it. He says, regarding your point that the modern world has polarized, what is your view on the future of democracy, given that it's only prevailed in a small number of cases for less than 500 years in the entire history of mankind?
Well, my answer to that is that, of course, I would view in the long term democracy as in the operation of this collective intelligence, that every person can participate. I think is the way it will go. Just like in the body, every cell has a part and participates to its ability, and I think that is the way it will go. Of course, it does, which I haven't talked about here, but there is, of course, a structure in society that, for instance, education, not everybody has the same education. Not everybody has the same opportunity to participate in the collective discussion. And so this is an ideal that everybody can participate. And I think if, as an answer to that question, yes, I think in the long run, I would hope if we don't make a big mistake in the meantime, I mean that many other species have disappeared, ours could too possibly, but if we don't make a big mistake, I think it will go in that direction, yes, increasing integration of the individual and participation of the individual in society.
Yes, I was fascinated by that remark that Sweden was more mature than Australia.
Well, I wouldn't say more mature.
Wouldn't you? No.
I would say a different ideology, that
Yeah.
the view of what is the common infrastructure and what is individual is different in the two nations. I would think also, it's my view, in the long run, that you will see that increase.
Now, here's a question from somebody who is called Good Empire. I don't know who that is. It says, "Hi, Erik. Is there a predictable reaction on an elemental level, or perhaps a physical correction or result, when there exists a sustained imbalance of elements interacting, as we're seeing in the inequity of wealth and opportunity across global societies? And may that tell us something about what will come?"
I missed one part of that.
When there is a sustained imbalance of elements interacting, as we have with the inequity of wealth or opportunity, will there be a predictable reaction to that?
The interaction that will spread on to a global level, if that's the question, so that there will be opportunities for a richer life, if you like, when the interaction spreads to a larger population. That is certainly true, and I think we're seeing that now, and that will continue into the future. If that was the question.
Well, perhaps the question might be seen the other way. Will this inequity lead to a breakdown of society?
The inequity. Well, the inequity is like a strain on society, on the world society. Again, this idea of the temperature, high and low temperatures, and I think it is a problem that we have at the moment, which I tried to say, that 1 billion people have a much higher standard of living than the other 6, is a strain on the evolution of society. And exactly how that will be solved, I mean, I don't have my crystal ball here now, so I can't tell you that. But there are some very significant risks in how we handle that, because the people that have the lower standard of living, they are becoming very aware of it because of the global information system. You see, that's what I tried to explain, that 500 years ago, there was also great inequality, but people didn't know about it because there was very much less communication. So I think, yeah.
I'd like to press you just a minute on the power of the press. It seems to me that we had a model where the press was enormously powerful in the post-war era, in many ways, with good intentions at heart. But as we've had the concentration of media ownership, as you say, a very narrow group of people have held on to the media. But it seems to me that in recent years, that control of information has shifted. And certainly the profitability has shifted, because after all, the media sell readers or consumers to advertisers, and the advertising dollars moved. So that we've got this proliferation of what I've heard called public spherules, little groups of inbred echo chambers, And the control of information is very much less now than it would have been 20 years ago.
Well, first of all, I think that's true. But first of all, it's not so much the control of information. It is the fact that here in the West, we have a very West-centric view. We all have. And that's things that are presented here. You can see, well, newspaper or TV or whatever, is simply, it's not that that there's anything bad behind it. It's just that is our view. Just like if you're a Catholic, then you think what the Pope says is true, and that's it. And here it is the same. We've grown up and we've been inoculated with this Western view of the world, and that's what what's being presented.
So that's why you argue for a very strong education which trains people in critical thinking.
That's exactly right, yes.
Ian Bryce has just come back correcting his my misunderstanding perhaps of his question. He said he was thinking about physics. He says, do brains and minds allow breaking of the laws of particle physics? And do they perhaps enable consciousness to arise from inanimate matter? Now, I don't know the answer to that question, but perhaps you do.
No, I don't know if I do, but I have my opinion. and I don't think that there is anything non-physical, that there's anything spiritual or non-physical. It just appears that way because the complexity is so great that we can't actually see through it, and so we say, oh, it must be something beyond the physical. But I don't think that it's, in my opinion, I think it's all neurons and patterns in the brain and so on.
Right. Okay. So there are no emergent properties in Ian's sense. There's another question here.
Not physically emergent properties, no, but of the information, of course, there are emergent properties.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Would you keep going on that?
Would I keep going on that?
Yeah, just, on information has emergent properties.
Well, yes. Just like when you look at physical, say, put physical elements together and they have a property that each element doesn't have. Of course, when you combine information, you can create another level of information by combining them. That is an emergent property of the information, and that is really what we're doing in many ways by our greater and greater understanding of the details of the world around us. We also create a better understanding of how they come together and their emergent properties, like, for instance, emergent properties of society.
There's an interesting question here from Hugh Price. It says, you end with copper, but one might ask whether your view that society evolves to maximize survival, is that a view which is falsifiable in Popper's sense?
If that view is, the
view that society evolves to maximize survival, what would be the sort of fact that would falsify that?
Oh, I mean, I have to say,
Popper says if it's a theory, it's got to be falsified.
No, I have to say that this idea, that is simply my belief. I said that is, in my view, I think there has been, if you look for a guiding property, a guiding principle in evolution, it has to be survival. And I think that the survival of the fittest, as in the case of Darwin, I think that is what we're seeing here in society also. And the evolution of society is driven by survival. It's just that what survival means. It doesn't mean survival of every individual, individuals are willing to give their lives for many things that they want to keep that survive, family or a nation. So what survives is much more complex than just the individual.
So do you think the nation states will wither away?
That brings up another issue. This, when you create more complex entities, like molecules into cells, or people into societies, and in the society you go from families to nations and whatever. The simpler elements do not disappear. They just change their function. And like the function of a molecule in a cell has a different function than just a free molecule, but it has a function within the cell. And if you take a family, the concept of a family, or the structural element of a family, is just as important in a nation. It just has taken on a different form than it had before. For instance, education used to be, very long ago, the education was a matter of within the family. Well, it's now been taken over by the state. Another thing is, for instance, the relationship between the people in the family, which used to be something completely within the family. That was a property of the family. In the society, because of the very close interaction, that is no longer acceptable. As we see with violence in the family, is something that the society does not allow or would like to allow. And so the family, has changed. It's the same with freedom of the individual, must also change. Our concept of the freedom of the individual. The individual is still there and has more and more opportunities and freedom in that sense. But on the other hand, it is more and more constrained by society. So that's how I see that.
Look, I've got one more question here from Tibor Molnar. In evolution, survival is an effect, not a cause. It's the result of what happens when an entity or a process or a species fails to be eliminated, fails or is eliminated. So in what sense can you maximize survival, he asks?
Well, what you maximize is in society. When I look at society, you can see the threats to society. And you can see sometimes, as I said, in 2 world wars, you can see how these threats became materialized. And how to maximize it? Well, I think, as I said, the more we have the people involved, the better. That's one way of maximizing it. A lot of the problems have come from a very small group, or even a single person like Hitler or somebody like that, having a lot of power. To maximize it, I think, is the distributed power in the people.
I must say, Erik, I admire your optimism, and I think this has been the most extraordinary canter, I would say, across a range of intellectual disciplines. I think I'll be lying awake thinking about water molecules and analogies, and then looking at your wheel behind you all night, trying to think this through. It has been a most fascinating discussion, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Royal Society for giving us all so many ideas to think about. And so now I'll hand over to the President, to Susan Bond, to farewell us all.
Thanks, Christy. It's my job as President to close the Ordinary General Meeting, which does include the open lecture that we've just been listening to. Thank you, everyone, for participating. And again, thank you, Erik, very much, Christy and Stuart. So good night, everyone. Farewell.